All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Natalie Bonowit of Bonowit Development Services and a consultant to the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. I've spent over 20 years developing, operating, and working on permanent supportive housing policy and will be moderating this panel of expert practitioners, conveners, and researchers. Today's webinar is focused on permanent supportive housing and specifically what it takes to operate PSH, permanent supportive housing, in a way that allows residents to thrive. On the panel, I'm joined by Anne Goggins-Gregory, who served as the Chief Data Wrangler for the PSH Cost Working Group. In a prior professional role, Anne led full cost analyses for various nonprofit organizations and coalitions. She brought that experience alongside her experience as a practitioner in her role as Senior Vice President of Resident Services for Mid-Penn Housing, and she brought that to the research that undergirds this brief. I'm also joined by Christy Ritchell, Vice President of Services at Satellite Affordable Housing Associates. Christy is a licensed clinical social worker with over 15 years experience in the social services field in various social service settings. She brings her clinical lens and diverse direct service experience to ensure that SAHA's Residents Services Department is person-centered, inclusive, trauma-informed, and impactful. Casey Archie is the Senior Vice President of Property Management at Mid-Penn Housing. With over 25 years experience, she leads a staff of over 250 people and has oversight of more than 8,000 affordable rental homes spanning 10 San Francisco Bay Area counties. She's responsible for all aspects of property operations, including financial performance, lease-ups, facility maintenance, compliance, resident satisfaction, and staff development. And our final panelist is Mark Chusignant, Director of Supportive Housing for Enterprise Community Partners in Southern California. Mark directs homelessness and supportive housing initiatives. He's currently directing PSH Preservation Initiative and systems change efforts to strengthen the coordinated entry system. And finally, I would like to introduce the primary author behind the brief we're discussing today, Carolina Reed, Faculty Research Advisor at the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. Carolina specializes in housing and community development with a specific focus on access to credit, housing and mortgage markets, urban poverty, and racial inequality. The goal for today is to share lessons learned from the last 2 years of the Permanent Supportive Housing Cost Working Group. This is a group of NPH members that pool data and money to see what could be learned by going deep into their respective permanent supportive housing portfolios and viewing it collectively with a bird's-eye lens. These nonprofits were motivated to come together to identify shared challenges in operating permanent supportive housing with the intention of finding shared solutions. The entire NPH PSH coalition is committed to ensuring that we're building housing and providing services so that residents can thrive and get the support they need to be successful. Recognizing that there are a lot of headwinds right now facing permanent supportive housing out there, we always want to reiterate, and we know, and the evidence supports, that permanent supportive housing works, and it needs to be resourced to be successful. This is an issue not only in the Bay Area, but everywhere. And while the levers to support change might be different across the nation, the themes appear consistent. To kick us off, Carolina will be sharing an overview of the recently published Turner Brief, Permanent Supportive Housing as a Solution to Homelessness, the critical role of long-term operating subsidies. After, the panelists will have an opportunity to dialogue and answer questions that I pose, and then there will be the opportunity for participant questions. We'll end on a positive note by asking each of the panelists what makes them hopeful and conclude by 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If webinar participants have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. Carolina, please take us away.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you to all of the panelists and the audience for joining us today. In my presentation, as Natalie said, I'm going to give a brief overview of our research report. I'm not going to say the title, it's long, you can see it on the slide. The full report is available on our website at the link that's going to be provided in the chat. And I just want to acknowledge that this study was truly a group effort, and I'm really grateful to all the organizations that shared data and learnings with us. To set the context for the study, I want to echo what Natalie said and highlight that PSH is an evidence-based model for ending homelessness. In rigorous studies, researchers have found that PSH has high rates of housing retention, even among people who have experienced chronic homelessness in the past. There's also growing evidence that the costs of providing PSH are offset by savings to other sectors, such as the healthcare and criminal justice systems. PSH is thus a critical component to California's efforts to address and end homelessness, one that the state has recognized by prioritizing funding for PSH, both through its existing housing programs, but also through innovative models like HomeKey. This study really sought to better understand what it means to provide high-quality PSH that leads to long-term reductions in homelessness. And we did so by examining the costs of operating permanent supportive housing and lifting up the voices of staff and residents in properties that provide PSH. The study involved both quantitative and qualitative methods. We focused on 26 properties in the Bay Area, representing more than 2,000 units, of which about half were set aside as PSH. We focused only on stabilized properties, by which we mean properties that were placed in service at least 3 years ago. And the 26 properties really varied in terms of who they were serving, the share of PSH, the number of total units, and whether or not the property was located in an urban or suburban location. Our analysis spanned 3 years of data. 2019 to 2021 cost data are actuals, whereas the 2022 data were budgeted. It's important to note that we took a whole picture view of operating costs. And by that, we mean we included staff and non-staff costs, we provided property management costs, and we focused on services costs, both those that were provided in-house, as well as those that were provided by third-party service providers. And we were revenue agnostic, which means that we did not analyze the sources of funding that went into those expenses, though it's really important to acknowledge that the expenses and available resources are shaped by what the funding allows. We also looked at resident outcome data. We looked at data on move-outs, on on-time rent payments, and on engagement with resident services, and we conducted interviews and focus groups with property-level staff and residents. This slide shows the per unit direct costs for the 26 properties in the sample for 2022. While it's not possible to get an exact apples to apples comparison, placed in service data for LIHTC projects in the Bay Area over roughly the same time period show annual operating costs at about $13,750 per unit. Our data found that while about a third of the sample were close or slightly below that average, a significant share of properties had much higher per unit operating costs. On average, properties in the sample were spending $17,000 per year per unit on the full suite of operating expenses. We also found that between 2018 and 2022, average costs increased by about 14% per unit, largely due to the need to increase wages in order to retain staff and recruit for open positions, but also due to external factors such as rising insurance costs. These increases exceed what is allowed under California's Department of Housing and Community Development Program guidelines, leading to concerns over allowable expenses. Interviews consistently highlighted that the need to reduce costs to make affordable housing projects pencil was leading them to under-budget resources for services and operating expenditures during the development process, raising concerns about the long-term viability of these properties and the impacts on residents. The research highlighted a number of factors that drive up operating expenses for PSH. First, these properties tend to need higher staff to resident ratios, as well as the need for higher trained staff. For example, people with clinical training or experiences with trauma-informed care. We also found that properties in urban locations tended to cost more. This was partly due to the fact that these buildings tended to be older, but it also reflected the higher security and front desk needs, especially for properties located near encampments. The third major driver of expenses was property maintenance and damage. Some of the costs were due to real property damage, such as flooding or fires in a unit, but there was also a need to address ongoing property management issues such as bed bugs. At one site, a staff person noted, "I know bed bugs aren't something we really talk about, but those treatments are extremely expensive, common, and recurring. That should be put into the budget. Every unit needs to be treated once a month. It's really hard to find resources for that." Another key finding was that there was a strong association between per unit direct costs and the number of distinct target populations at a single property. On average, properties that served 4 or more populations, for example, a mix of transitional aged youth, chronically homeless individuals, domestic violence survivors, and veterans, had the highest per unit operating costs. Providers shared 2 reasons for why that might be the case. On the property management side, working with and reporting to multiple different funding agencies increases regulatory compliance and coordination costs. One interviewee noted, "There are potentially 9 different case managers from 9 different agencies that are supporting 9 different residents. There is no possible way that at any given time that can all be dialed in so it's efficient or effective for the resident or for the staff in the mix." On the resident service side, the increased costs relate to the more specialized staff who are needed, who are trained to meet the unique needs of different populations, such as veterans and transitional age youth. A resident services coordinator explained, "The needs for a developmentally disabled unit are very different than one with a Mental Health Services Act funding that's chronically homeless with chronic mental illness, and it requires a different set of skills. We don't just have one type of special needs." Universally, frontline staff expressed concern that property level resources were insufficient to meet the needs of people living in their buildings. Staff reported feeling ill-equipped to provide the necessary care and support to a population with greater needs, especially as referral systems increasingly prioritize people with significant health challenges and/or other barriers to sustaining housing. Staff directly connected the rise in higher acuity populations with the need for additional resources, saying, for example, "The longer someone's been out on the streets, the more likely it is that they're going to have all sorts of, mental health, substance use, and medical issues, more trauma. In terms of the mystery of why we're spending more money to do this in San Francisco, it's really pretty simple. It costs more to address those levels of trauma." Staff also consistently expressed that on-site staffing levels were lower than needed. One provider said that numbers aren't the whole story. "I've got a building with PSH, and even though it's only 20 units that are formerly homeless, it's a higher needs population. But my service coordinator is only there 2 days a week because that's what the funding allows. A lot happens in between that." The lack of sufficient resources has negative implications for resident well-being. The quantitative data shows that after accounting for location and resident composition, properties with lower resources saw higher rates of negative move-outs and less engagement with resident services. Staff interviews highlighted that their single biggest concern was insufficient mental health supports, noting, "You never know the next step or the next minute what will happen because the resident is hyper and aggressive. If we had a clinician or mental health professional in-house, I think they could help de-escalate, get the resident calmed down." Several properties also face the need to cut back on the number of staff serving the building, such as maintenance, property management, front desk, and resident service coordinators. One staff said, "I have to serve every PSH resident. I'm being asked to double the number of households to do it by myself." These dynamics were also linked to staff burnout and turnover, which we found negatively impacts resident trust. One resident shared that staff turnovers show me that either they don't care or they're not being trained well enough to address our concerns. And so they would rather move on to another assignment and not deal with us because they have something else better to do. And that really, really makes me angry. Despite these challenges, we also found that PSH works. And given the right level of investment in staffing, residents can thrive. A highlight for me in one of the focus groups was a resident who had experienced chronic homelessness said that moving into PSH had allowed him to bloom, regain custody of his daughter, and support her getting into college. Another moment was when several veterans who had formerly been homeless, participating in a focus group, emphasized the value of building community with the seniors living at the same property and watching the seniors and veterans embrace and laugh about how they support one another through tough times. But the study also highlights that adequate funding is critical for keeping people housed, maintaining high quality housing, and supporting resident well-being. The lack of resources to support operations will undermine state efforts to expand the supply of PSH, as well as erode trust in the effectiveness of the model. There are pathways forward, some which will be easier and some harder to implement. We need to collectively advocate for an expansion of project-based vouchers at the federal scale and improve alignment and coordination of voucher resources at the local level. We also need to build the capacity and infrastructure to allow housing providers to tap into healthcare funding, particularly around supportive services. CalAIM in California provides one pathway for that, but there are other mechanisms by which those healthcare dollars could help support permanent supportive housing. We need to create more flexibility in California state policies that cap services costs to ensure that resources are aligned with specific property needs. And finally, we need to undertake efforts to improve systems such as coordinated entry. We need to reduce fragmentation in how we finance affordable housing. And we need to build the capacity of the mental health system to better support PSH over the long term. With that, I'll pass it back to Natalie, and I really look forward to the panel conversation.
Thank you so much, Carolina. It's really such a pleasure to have facts, research, the evidence that undergirds our experience every day. And so with that, I'd like to jump into the first question among our expert panel of permanent supportive housing practitioners and conveners. And with the focus on how the research is experienced on the ground, and also to be able to discuss strategies for addressing the needs of residents and staff in properties that experience insufficient funding. And so, Anne, I'm going to start with you, and you really supported the cost analysis for this project alongside Room 40 Group. What was the one thing you learned from this process that really stood out to you?
Thanks, Natalie, and thank you, everybody. Great to be here. I think that what I would want to raise up is that with the best of intentions, we segment things, we segment work, we segment vulnerable populations, and it actually makes the work way harder, way more difficult to do sense making on, and frankly, doesn't necessarily set us up for success. So I would highlight two examples of that. The first is Carolina shared that as you layer different permanent supportive housing populations, your cost per unit goes up. And I think if you dig in and talk to those residents, they wouldn't say that more money would be better. I think they would say it feels really complex and kind of murky. And I, as a practitioner, I understand the really well-intentioned policies and procedures that say, let's take constituencies that are most vulnerable and really preference them for these properties or these units. But in practicality, it actually makes it way harder and way more complex for us as operators to do great work. Another example of this would be, we came together as property managers, service providers, asset managers to do sense making together. And we combined all of our data and we looked at all of our cost stacks. And in so many of the conversations that we've had sharing back this data, we often get the question, well, could you pull out just services data? But what about it as a third-party contract? But like, what's really happening with maintenance? Can I get the cut for San Mateo County in particular? And again, I understand where that desire comes from. But as operators, the work happens in community. The work happens between property and services and third party and local community partners. And so the value to us of really being able to learn together sometimes I think gets lost when we talk to partners who really want to parse it more finely for their own needs.
Super helpful. Thank you, Anne. And now I want to bring the questioning over to Christy. So obviously services like property management is a critical pillar for permanent supportive housing. And the question for you is, what shifts have you seen in terms of the permanent supportive housing target populations in your properties? And what are the implications of those shifts on the types of services that are needed for residents?
Yeah, thank you. Good to see everyone. And to really build off what, Carolina and what Anne have already shared, what we've seen at the individual resident level and at the community level is that our applicants and the folks that are coming into our PSH units, have really complex comorbidities and high acuity. They're coming in with multiple chronic health conditions, substance use, some serious and persistent mental illnesses, some histories of extensive trauma. The length of time that they have been unhoused seems to continue to extend. When we first started doing, PSH housing, oftentimes it was closer to that 1 year mark of chronic homelessness. And now it's often, 5, 10, 15, 20 years of folks coming into housing and into living in community. And that length of time mixed with all those comorbidities, also brings some real challenges around coordinating all the different services that those folks need. Our staff are spending much more time trying to hold together and this pretty disparate and sometimes broken systems of care that don't always talk to each other. And in that effort, we're also experiencing on the site level, really witnessing when the system fails and when systems of care break down, and how that leads and contributes to increased frequency and severity of critical incidents and safety issues that impact both of our residents and our staff safety and well-being. We've seen increases in violence, whether that's interpersonal violence, domestic violence, or community-related crime, mental health crises, suicides, overdose. It's just, we've seen just the cumulative impact of trauma playing out in people's lives. And it's tough. It's tough. And that has just increased over the past several years.
Well, building off of that, I'd like to dig in a little more about what makes it difficult to serve the resident needs. And so, Casey, can you help us with describe some of the challenges that you face in managing properties with PSH?
Sure, thanks, Natalie. And I'll piggyback on a lot of what's been said already. For the property management frontline staff, they're faced with day-to-day challenges managing mental health crises and emergency incidents that occur at the property, i.e., as Carolina had said before, like fires that happen in the units, and then from the fires that happen from the PSH population, the sprinkler systems go off. It floods the building. We have to relocate family or the residents. And this creates just staff burnout. The staff becomes so overwhelmed. And there's also concerns, as everyone has already said, with regards to the safety and the well-being of our staff. And from this, we get turnover. The turnover rates shoot through the roof. And then this also impacts our residents. Our residents rely on the staff, and we can't build relationships. The trust is diminished. When that happens, residents stop paying rent, and their housing stability is really impacted negatively by all of these things. Those are some of the greatest challenges that we've been experiencing in the property management side.
And this is a reminder, of course, from a panelist perspective, feel free to popcorn. But Christy, based on building on what Casey just said, maybe you can talk about some of the challenges from a resident services perspective in meeting the needs of residents.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're similar to what Casey was just sharing on the services side. We've seen how Also, the increase need has driven, third-party providers to try and recruit more, case managers and clinical staff. They're running into, and as are we, such a high demand for highly skilled staff to serve these populations. And frankly, there's not enough folks out there to do this work right now. And so we're experiencing this skill gap as well. I think the traditional service coordinator, doesn't role in terms of their experience, their skill, their areas of focus, their tasks, the service delivery. It doesn't, it's hard to scale that up into serving PSH. And we're working on it all the time, and our staff work tirelessly to serve tenants. And we need more clinical staff. We need that revamp of the behavioral health care system. We need a deeper workforce bench to support our tenants.
And that sort of gets to some of the systemic issues that we have. And so I do want to pivot to the development process and ask Mark if you can share a little bit about how the development process and financing of permanent supportive housing contributes to operating challenges.
Sure, it's great to be with you. Just wanted to acknowledge Turner Center's research and the report, and just the webinar opportunity to really share more knowledge on these themes is just so important for the field. I mean, the development and financing aspect of the industry is where a lot of the weight's carried, clearly, right? It's the glitzier part of the industry. We've been doing a really good job, obviously, creating housing, but I think as the report's noted, I mean, if we're not really managing the long-term sustainability needs of this model, we're really obviously bringing into question sort of the efficacy of the long-term investment we're making with a lot of public resources. We know it's extremely competitive to secure financing, so owners and developers are having to go after multiple sources to make some really tough decisions on targeting and the type of populations that we're sort of weaving together in these buildings. And I think as a result, right, we're just inherently complicating the challenge of what it takes to maintain these deals. So you're looking at different eligibility requirements, working with different system partners on the ground at the systems level to make this work, whether you're securing referrals or providing the services for these populations. So it's all very challenging, and you're doing this years in advance of when you're going to actually put these deals into operation. So you're going on your best assumption, right, that this is really going to be viable in the end. But I think we're learning a lot about, downstream, maybe we would have done things differently on the design standpoint. I think you also got to think about the underwriting of these deals and just the fact that it's very fluid right now. As the report notes, these different sort of budget kind of assumptions and what's actually playing out on the ground is really, I think these costs are outpacing anything that we projected. So just, you're more likely to see a project suffer potentially financially or have cash flow concerns earlier in its life cycle than you might have, thought about or experienced that in the old days. So I just think it's really challenging to sort of, reconcile the current reality with some of the assumptions that we make when we design these deals. The other concern is just the fact that supportive housing is not a monolithic stock of housing. You've got a lot of earlier legacy supportive housing that were obviously financed and sort of underwritten in a certain era that is not necessarily, consistent with the experience right now, or at least what we're asking of these projects to perform. So just remember that I mean, even though this sample is relatively younger projects, there's a lot of older deals out there that are even less equipped, I think, financially and physically to meet these needs. I know we're looking at that in LA, tracking about 2,000 plus units that are really in that older category that are really need preservation support. And that's probably a whole nother webinar to really cover. But and then finally, just I think this was touched on a little bit earlier, but this potential disconnect, or I think it's a pretty obvious disconnect between the housing finance system, which has been around for decades, and our homelessness system really having to integrate more meaningfully to make PSH work in this modern era. Is a tremendous challenge. I think, we see it play out on the ground. We're trying to fill units, or, we get questions from matchers like, why are you guys making it so hard for us to fill these units? Why are you making these deals so complicated? Well, there's a reason why that's happening right upstream with the way we finance and incentivize certain projects. So it is a way, I think, forward for us to be more connected between the two systems. We all serve the same constituencies. We have similar goals, but we really need to be in lockstep if we're going to meet those common kind of outcomes. So I think that's a big kind of area of work moving forward too.
I think that makes sense. And then this goes back to how does that relate to a practitioner level? So back to Christy and then Casey, what are the systemic factors that you would highlight as being most important to driving the operating challenges that we have?
I think, as you know, this has come up multiple times about the weaving together of the financing part of and to serve different populations. Each of those financing requirements and those funders have different requirements around staffing levels, service provided, even training requirements for staff. And that weaving together really increases the compliance complexity. We're also seeing a real push from funders on reporting and very detailed documentation around those compliance measures. We are seeing that while the system of care, particularly around, housing navigation and ongoing tenant services that have that higher level of intensive case management or clinical case management, there's a lot of inconsistency around the quality of that, the ability for those organizations to have folks work on site and be available in those moments of crisis, in those moments of needs. And that really has to do, it connects back to all the different funding streams and fields that are trying to be woven together into this one project to serve the same population.
So I'll jump in and ditto Christy. I think the compliance complexity of all of these deals is really very challenging. And I would say especially at the lease up time, there's occupancy requirements. We have to lease it up at a certain date. It's really hard to get some of the population that we're moving in to get the documents that they need to move in. How is someone that's been homeless for 5-6 years going to find a birth certificate or other documents that are not easily available for them? So that's been really challenging for us. The other is just the multiple layers of populations that we house in one property can be extremely challenging too. And the level of work that the staff has to do in order to be in compliant with all of the regulatory agencies governing the PSH property is just proven to be ridiculous at some times. And then the last I would say is just the lack of funding to adequately staff the properties. That is one of our greatest challenges.
All right, well, thank you both. And I do want to pivot to the experience in LA. So Mark, clearly the research conducted here is based in the Bay Area, but do the themes resonate from your experience in Southern California?
Completely. I think there wasn't a single part of this report that didn't resonate, which was just had me scratching my head thinking, God, like so much of this is what we're experiencing on the ground. We just kind of had to put it on paper. And I just applaud, the coalition and the Turner Center for obviously documenting these things that really had largely just been, I think, not understood very well or certainly, researched. I do think a few themes stood out, among that list. I mean, obviously just the fact that we're hearing a lot of angst around these cost pressures and these escalations of operating costs over time. Being able to put some definition on those per unit numbers and what some of those categories are that are really trending, obviously in a real difficult direction for folks, I think, has created a real sense that providers feel like they're being asked to do more with less, or at least not enough for what's commensurate with the need out there for the populations we're serving. So it really puts the onus on them, right? Obviously to cover that burden. I think that's very challenging, sustainably speaking for these organizations. Secondly, I think just making the connection on resident outcomes and, sort of what like the sort of resource levels need to be, obviously is tremendously smart, I think. And I was really excited to see that sort of connection being made, because when we know it's working well, we know how transformative PSH is, right? At its best when it's resourced. And I think the report really spoke to that. It had some good kind of quotes in there about that. But we know when it's not working as well, we do see those negative outcomes around rent arrears, obviously move outs potentially, retention issues with staff, just overall building community and engaging residents and services, right? All those areas obviously will suffer. In the sense that, like, I think providers feel that they're being stretched too thin to accommodate, I think, the level of need in the population is a huge theme down here. No easy answers on that, but I think just acknowledging the fact that, like, not all PSH is set up equally. It's not necessarily going to be able to accommodate all the diversity of levels of need that's out there. And I think, we got to recognize that we need different pathways. We even need higher levels of care for interventions beyond what we can accommodate in PSH. I think it's just not fair to expect that we can accommodate the range of what we're being asked to, I think, in the field. So that's a big theme here. And it does speak to a bigger system need around where we expand those options. And then I think finally, probably goes without saying, you mentioned this in the intro, just the discussions around coordinated entry and just knowing that there's some challenges, right, with capacity and the performance of that system with respect to our demands, right, in the real estate space, I think is tremendously important to just note. It's not been talked about a lot, certainly not been documented a whole lot, but I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I'm just so glad to see some attention on that.
I mean, it's sort of a perfect twist to thinking about innovations. Where are we going with innovations? And so to that level, and before we open it up to questions and answers from the webinar participants, Casey, would you mind talking first about some of the innovations that you're seeing within property management that are leading to progress?
Sure. One of the things we're doing that we've seen is improved collaboration and teamwork between the property management, resident services, and in our third-party vendors that we use. And we've really started doing joint educational trainings for both teams together so that we're getting the same information and really understanding the roles and responsibilities so that teams feel more supported that are on the ground doing the work. We are in property management actually going outside of the normal property management industry pool looking for staffing now. We're looking at staff that are applicants, candidates that have background in social services, and then bringing them along for the property management ride and teaching them about the asset management component of that. And then just awareness and practice of trauma-informed operational practices.
Yeah, thank you, Casey. I couldn't agree more that intentional, thoughtful, trauma-informed collaboration between the site staff across serving that whole community and all of our different roles, even maintenance, and it's so critical and is something we found to be really increasing in importance as we serve these higher need communities and residents. Another thing that we have tried recently and found to be pretty effective is that we are Saha, or the property, is contracting with our third-party providers, right? They receive their funds directly from the county through multiple different funding sources. There's FSB, there's CalAIM, there's all sorts of different funding streams that they're receiving to provide the services to the tenants in our PSH units. The challenge is that residents have a right to self-determination, which means they may not want those services. They may not want to work with that organization. They may want to work with them one day and then disenroll the next day. And this model of being paid by the service delivery really makes it challenging for our third-party providers to be on site at the levels that we need them to be, and even that they want to be. And so in order to make that happen, we're providing these small sort of gap funding contracts to them directly, with the main focus of them being on site so that they can do that consistent, persistent outreach, and also just be available when incidents happen, when staff needs support or residents need support. And that scattered site model creates a challenge to that. And this has been really helping us have the on-site presence of trained and highly skilled staff.
Well, those are exciting innovations, and I hope they get to continue, and hopefully it's not one-offs like you were saying with individual grants, and how do we make that more systemic. By switching gears, or not switching gears, in that same vein, Mark, can you talk about the efforts for coordinated entry reform in Los Angeles? And then after you talk, we will pick up some questions from the participants in the webinar.
Sure. No, I mean, again, just excited to see that this made its way into the paper. I know it's such a hot topic, and I think, again, where we are in LA, at least for Enterprise's involvement, really for the last few years, is trying to figure out what are some of the bottlenecks, what are some of the pain points, what are some of the solutions. It's all about trying to get the most out of the system, right? We totally believe in the philosophy behind it, right? It's equitability goals. But it's just had some growing pains, right? Just trying to make sure we can make this thing work. So, that's been a focus for us, is really digging in, trying to understand kind of what actually is needed to be sort of introduced for improvements of the system. And part of that is just making sure that voice of the development community is in the mix. So we were noticing that there was a little absence on that historically with some of the problem solving and sort of process improvement exercises, and just making sure that the folks leading homelessness systems are really grounded in the day-to-day operational needs and constraints, compliance as well, with those delivering housing on the ground. So I think that's been a new exciting endeavor in the last year, is creating a space specifically for the developers to advise our continuum of care lead, LASA, around what that agenda should look like. And we're co-convening that bi-weekly with them right now. It's making good headway. It's a lot of education, a lot of demystification, just around what we're up against, what we're able to do. And what they did is they sort of prioritized 4 issue areas for improvement. So document readiness or match readiness, multiple matching, or the notion of getting more referrals per unit, serving high acuity households, and then just challenging to fill units. So we've got some consensus recommendations around those issue areas that we're kind of currently, we can finalize those in December. We're currently kind of activating those with these public agencies. And so we are seeing some significant change. I think some of this is politically motivated, right? Because this notion of really resolving unsheltered homelessness, getting folks into interim housing, that throughput into permanent housing is so integral. It's not a peripheral issue to be working on bottlenecks into permanent housing. So we're really excited to see that kind of more front and center. And we're seeing some movement on that agenda. We're seeing shifts in prioritization, an effort to make matches document ready on the front end before they're matched, limits on non-responsive matches, where we can't locate the client or the point of contact, being able to kind of move on to the next match, targeting regional sort of enrollments for outreach and sort of interim housing enrollments nearby the site, so that we can try to alleviate concerns around folks being connected or being able to be found, adjacent to those properties. And then just allowing like batches of matches up front to be processed, obviously, as we're developing or leasing up projects, is a huge win. And I think a lot more needs to happen, but we're starting to see some movement on that agenda. And I think these are things that are not unique to LA.
It is super helpful. It is really exciting to see progress. And now we have less time for participant questions. Anne, would you like to elevate any in particular?
Yeah, I wanted to start building on Mark's comments in your question and see if Casey or Christy had additional thoughts on coordinated entry. So there are a lot of questions coming through about modulating level of acuity. There are some questions about 100% high acuity buildings versus more of a mix and so forth. So Casey and Christy, anything else you would like to add to some of the CES reform or revisions conversation?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest things is being able to widen the band of folks who are eligible for PSH, so that we're, just as they're doing those assessments, that they can go deeper into their roster, because I think very often folks that are landing in the rapid rehousing or the other types of housing actually probably need PSH as well. And, they're not getting access to that level of support because the band that's being referred is so tight at the top. I think that also pulls in and addresses some of the need around having a wider range of folks with different types of disabilities and trauma and levels of acuity, which would be helpful. And then also, my biggest hope is just a little bit more flexibility. I feel like we're always trying to find this exact person, at the exact moment, and that it translates into more folks staying unhoused and being unhoused longer, and our units remaining vacant. And it feels like we're sort of, what's that old adage? We're cutting off our nose to spite our face. Like it's not, there's some ways to smooth out those efficiencies, I think.
Christy said everything I wanted to say, so thank you for that, Christy.
Sorry, Casey.
So another set of questions are around roles and responsibilities for site staff on both the property and services side. And it's come up in a few different forms. So I think the question would be, to what extent do roles and responsibilities of a case manager, service coordinator, desk clerk look different in mixed buildings, PSH plus family or senior, as compared to 100% PSH? So it's, you know, that mixing of populations and roles was of interest to a lot of folks.
Maybe I could just jump in for a second from the research side. I think this was one of the big questions was, you know, should you have buildings that are mixed PSH and family or mixed PSH and seniors? And I think there was a lot of sort of pre-assumptions that those buildings might not work as well, that there might not be the same sort of sense of community in those buildings. And I will say that from the research side, it really varied depending on the property. At some properties, that mixing of populations was really beneficial to residents in that they were really building strong social and community ties. In other properties, it was leading to conflict. And there's no way to sort of specify exactly what made the difference, but I do think that having well-trained on-site services staff and property management staff help to create those connections between those different groups of populations and build community in a way that was beneficial for all. But Christy, curious to hear what you've seen in your properties, because I think you have a mix of properties.
Yeah, you know, some of our buildings that were involved in this study have, you know, 4 or 5 different populations within them. And I would 100% agree that when the property was opened and we intentionally found a staff member and were able to hire staff that were more experienced, right, that had, you know, previous experience working with those populations, also had this you know, sort of innate desire to like learn and challenge themselves and like build new skills, made it really possible to build those connections and to hold space for all those different needs. I think more holistically, we have started to, which we hadn't done when I first joined Saha, we've had to create additional service coordinator positions that skill up over time and create pathways for professional development, but also are aligned with the needs of that building. So we now have supportive housing service coordinators, and those folks all need to have some certifications or training or past experience working with those special needs populations. We have like an internal sort of case management team that jumps in when the system is failing and they can't get a tenant to engage with outside community programs. They jump in and provide the intensive case management in that one-on-one time. And I think something I've heard from staff is that they are kind of in the standard service coordinator role. They are feeling pulled in many directions. They need to provide programs around health and education and basic needs. They need to, you know, do annual assessments, ADLs or family assessments. They need to respond to crises. They need to make individual service plans. And that widening demand of their skills and their time is stressful, but it's also what's being required of us at this moment from both our tenants' needs and also, you know, our funders. I'm not sure if I answered the question exactly, but feel free to ask me clarification questions.
Well, from a Casey, like this is our last point before we talk about what makes us hopeful. And I just want to make sure, Casey, did you have anything you wanted to add about mixing of target populations and general populations and not?
No, it's the same as what Christy said. It's just, you know, the staffing and the skill level of the staff. And then, you know, making decisions at some properties where I feel that desk clerks are more in the line than security, for instance, at some of those properties that have multiple layers of populations and where we're mixing with just families. It's easier to have a desk clerk that has great customer service skills and has gone through some of the training as opposed to a security guard, because for those families that are not in the PSH population, it's not as jarring for them when you have a person that's serving as a desk clerk concierge type staff. It just makes it more meaningful for them and able to live in the community.
So this is a perfect pivoting point to talk about what makes us hopeful. And believe it or not, despite the headwinds, of which there are many, and despite the incursions onto even the success of PSH, despite all that, again, we have more headwinds than we've ever experienced. And yet there are items to be hopeful for. And so starting with you, Anne, what makes you hopeful? We're going to go all the way around the panelists, and then we'll have conclusions.
What makes me most hopeful is that this conversation is happening in mixed company, if you will. I can't believe, like, I'm a total data wonk and I'm like a very, like, I have a list of things I'd like to advance, and where are we with that? And in this context, what I want to say is it actually matters who's at the table and why they're there. And this feels really different to have funders and policymakers and developers and property managers and asset managers and service providers and researchers at the table saying, gosh, this is hard, but there are ways we could probably make it easier if we talk to one another. And that gives me hope.
Casey?
Along the same lines, this coalition has given me hope. With all of the different entities that came together, our voice is stronger together. And now we can get out there and do the advocacy work that we need to do to move some of this work forward.
Mark?
I mean, I'm just so encouraged with the kind of consensus that we're at in the field that PSH is such an important investment in our communities to end homelessness. And I just feel like we're at that point now where we don't need to kind of wait for another generation to try to figure this out. Like, the time is now, and I think the momentum is here. We're getting more wisdom and experience around sort of what's needed to move forward, that there will be sort of an equal commitment to not only create that supply, but to maintain it and sustain it over time. I don't think we have any other choice. And I am encouraged with the directions that we're heading in, that there's a little more sensitivity to that and a little bit more direction around where we go next.
Christy?
Similarly, I feel really excited and hopeful that this is not staying in just a housing field, that it's, housing is being talked about under the umbrella of like health and wellness. And so just widening that tent, because we're all intersecting each other on the regular, and to have this internal coordination of folks that are in this industry, as well as starting to bring folks in other related fields into the conversation so that we can, we'll just have a better impact and a bigger impact if we're all headed in the same direction. So I get excited when I see those things coming together.
Me too. And so, Carolina, I'm going to give you the last word. I'm going to first talk about what makes me hopeful, and then give you the last word.
But then you're going to take all of them, and I'm going to have nothing left to say.
Still, after I do it then, and then after what makes you hopeful, then maybe you can also talk about future briefs, and definitely have the last word given this Turner webinar that we're having. But I'm going to say, taking a step back from a process perspective, I want to talk about 3 movements that make me hopeful that I think are going to move the needle in different ways. And so one of them is a recent, so this is definitely taking a step back about policy and systems. But one of I was really excited to read about the HUD waiver in LA, where for coordinated entry, there is an agreement that folks didn't have to be, and Mark touched on this, 100% document ready before they moved in. That is an amazing waiver. That's new and that's exciting. So that gave me some hope that there is room, as Christy was saying, for building in flexibility into our systems to actually meet people's needs, as opposed to being put into one of the different boxes. That was one thing I'm excited by. Another thing I'm really excited by is for folks who are in California, there's Assembly Bill 1085, which begins the process of working to get a federal benefit for services. So it'll take a while. If it passes, there's still steps to be done. But really, when we look about what do we need more resources, and that potential resource, not yet, but we can fight for it, that potential resource would dwarf the services funding capacity of CalAIM. So if it passes, it would be a significant new resource that would really help our properties. And the third thing I'm really excited about and give hope for is at least in the Bay Area, for the first time, the collective we that is the Bay Area, will have the opportunity next year to vote on a new regional housing finance authority. And that would be a game changer. We all know that housing is not an individual jurisdiction issue, but it is a regional issue. And with that, the potential constitutional amendment. So those are three things that really would help systemically to move the needle and gives me hope. And with that, Carolina, I pass the baton to you. What gives you hope and what are your next steps for research?
So I'm going to say plus 1,000 to everything everybody else said. All those things give me hope. And then I will say that I was really taken with hope and joy in doing the resident-led focus groups and hearing their perspectives, hearing not only the incredible challenges they've overcome to find housing, the success that they've had by being in housing, but also their insights into what isn't working well and what they need to thrive, and the ways in which they are actually very astute learners of the system and recognize that the system is failing them in multiple ways. And so I'm excited about some of the efforts to bring more lived experience voices into policy making and into our programs and decision making. So really excited about that. We have a lot of research coming out this fall from Turner and others on homelessness. And so really encourage you all to sign up for our mailing list where you'll get everything that comes out, and want to really thank all of our panelists. I also want to thank Ryan Finnegan, our Associate Research Director for Homelessness, who has been eagerly typing answers in the chat. And so I'm just really excited for next steps. So thank you all for joining us. I will maybe finalize by saying we will put this recording up on our website, so please feel free to refer to others to it.
It's really been a pleasure to spend this hour with everybody. Thank you for everybody participating, and to the panelists and to Ryan and Carolina, of course. So thank you so much for this opportunity.